Vanakkam. Hello friends. As we continue on the journey of exploring the emergence of the Moovendar beginning with the early Cholas, a quick recap into the setting of ancient Tamilagam around the middle of the first millennium BCE will help us understand the background from which the Moovendar emerged. We have seen in detail in earlier episodes of how the Tamil landscape at that time was under the fivefold division of Kurinji, Mullai, Marutham, Neidal and Palai, of how the Kuravar of the mountainous regions, the Kurinji, were ruled by a Verpan, of how the Baradavar of the coastal Neidal plains were ruled by a Thuraivan. In his book, The Tamils 1800 years ago, Kanagasabai Pillai describes them as the Villavar and the Meenavar respectively. The Villavar, the men who lived by the bow, and the Meenavar, mean being the fish, the coastal littoral people who were dependent on the seas for their livelihood. And he shows the remnants of these ancient tribes in the Bills and the Meenas of Rajasthan and Gujarat respectively, remnants of an ancient Dravidian substratum. Their fluctuating economic condition did not allow them to progress beyond tribal chieftaincy in those early times. As for the Palai region, the Einar or Veduvar, who had waylaying and robbery as a way of life under the rule of a Meili, could not aspire for any meaningful political kingship as they were nomads and had no territory to call their own. The remaining two, the Ayar of the Mullai regions, the forest lands, and the Velir of the Marutham regions, the agricultural lands, advanced to a settled way of life, establishing territorial kingships under the names of a Ko and a Vel. The Kirar of the Marutham lands, by accruing wealth from the fertile riverine plains and by controlling the river ports, slowly rose to prominence and emerged as masters of the land, the monarchs. Chieftains coexisted as independent rulers over their respective territories, ruling over their tribes. The allusions in Sangam poems show how before they came into their own, the Moovendar had to contest with these tribal rulers and had to either wipe them out completely or making them their feudatories with some sort of political alliance. Now, we have seen about this in detail in previous episodes and I will leave the relevant links here. So, the Moovendar were not ordained as divine rulers of the solar dynasty or the lunar dynasty as was made out. They had very humble beginnings. As K.N. Sivaraja Pillai puts it, and I quote, "The whole political history of ancient Tamilagam was the history of the conquest, in the end, of all the other tribes by the agricultural, that is the Velir, and the establishment of the Tamil sovereignties in the valley regions adjoining the Periyar, the Vaigai, the Porunai and the Kaveri." KNS traces this political history of early Tamilagam based on his research of the entire Sangam corpus in his The Chronology of the Early Tamils, published in 1932. He creates synchronistic tables for 10 generations of the early Cholas, Cheras and the Pandyas. Nilakanta Sastri, in his book The Cholas, published in the year 1935, starts the early Chola lineage with that of Karigala, the hero of Pattinapalai, and he elaborates more on the rule of the medieval Cholas who came after the 8th century Common Era. KNS establishes this Karigala as Karigala II, and he takes the early Cholas 5 generations earlier to that period based on the references from the Sangam works, while acknowledging that Sangam poems are very realistic and prima facie trustworthy. Nilakanta Sastri points out that the poems are lost in chronological obscurity. While many of the poems have colophons, that is, giving the names of the rulers, he dismisses the information given in the colophons as insufficient to establish a timeline. Nevertheless, he says, and I quote, "Still, after all allowance is made, the evidence from indigenous literature for the history of the early Chola kingdom will be seen to be not inconsiderable in volume and, if used with care, will go far to echo the testimony of archaeology." Now, this is exactly what KNS did in creating the synchronistic tables of the Moovendar. KNS takes us back in time to a period when the famed Chola capital of Urayur had not come within the control of the Cholas. The earliest he could go, based on the strength of Sangam works, is 50 BCE. Remember, we have seen a few attestations such as the inscriptions of Karavela and the Vartikas of the grammarian Katyayanar, which place the origins of the Movendar to around 6th century BCE. Nilaganda Sastri, in his The Cholas, gives an additional testimony by way of referencing the noted British Indologist Kennedy James, who wrote a series of articles on the maritime history of India in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. Kennedy taught Indian history at the University College London. He writes that the maritime trade between India, especially South India, and the Western world was well established by the 6th century BCE. In a debate on whether the Greek term for the word rice, that is oraiza, came from the Tamil word arisi, he writes, whatever be the ambiguity surrounding the linguistic issue, the fact that the maritime trade of that period was regulated by a well-oiled trade mechanism is beyond doubt. So, our hypothesis is that that mechanism should have been controlled by a ruler, a monarchy that should have been functioning at some level. Unfortunately, no direct sources have been found so far to corroborate these references, and as such, we delve into the history of the early Cholas starting from 50 BCE with KNS leading the way. KNS shows how Tamilagam of that period didn't even extend till Vengadam, as is claimed in the Payiram of the Tolgapiyam, which he feels was a much later interpolation. The northern regions of that period were known as Pullikadu and was under the rule of a chieftain called Pulli, who belonged to the Kanva tribe. South of this lay the Arkadu, which was under the control of another chieftain by the name Alisi. KNS shows how Alisi must have been an independent ruler of some might, as Arkadu was also known as Alisikadu. Early Tamil literature called these regions as Aruva Nadu and Aruva Vadadalai Nadu, and many villages along the Palaru even today take the R prefix such as Arakkonam, Arani, Arapakkam, all falling within the extent of today's South Arcad and North Arcad and Chengalpet districts, remnants of an ancient past. We saw in the previous episode of how KNS extols Paranar for recording many a piece of history in his poems, albeit in a very disjointed way. In the Kurundogai poem 258, he sings, Varalam Seri Tarninrare Alarahindrar Peruma Kaviri Palaradu Perundurai Marudodu Pinitha Yendu Kotiyane Sendan Tandai Ariyalam Puhavinan Thotu Vetai Niraya Volval Ilayar Perumahan Arisi Arkad Anna Ival Palitir Manalam Tolaidal Kande. This Kurundugai poem has an aham setting, meaning that it is a love poem, and here the maiden friend, the Thori of the heroine, forbids the lover from either sending a message or trying to come and meet her in person, adding that her situation has already been setting tongues wagging in the neighborhood and has been wreaking havoc on her beauty. Here, she uses two beautiful similes to describe the beauty of the heroine. In the poetic convention of that era, the capital of one ruler or the other was brought in comparison, and the splendor of the capital was compared to the beauty of the heroine. And here in this poem, Paranar uses not one but two capital cities to highlight the beauty of his heroine, one being Arkadu of Arisi, the other being Urandai of Sendan on the banks of the Kaveri, thereby giving us a veritable piece of history. Sendan was the son of Alisi and ruled over Urandai. Paranar sings the praise of both father and son. Sendan, who inherited the throne of Arkadu from his father Alisi, obviously should have extended his rule to Urandai, deduces KNS. Urandai later came to be known as Urayur. During this time, a Veli ruler by the name Veliyantittan ruled over Veerai, a coastal town near the Kaveri Delta. KNS quotes from stanza 58 of the Nattinai, one of the earliest works of the Sangam poems, where the poet Mudukuttanar sings of the ruler of Veerai, Venman Veliyan Tittan. Venman or Velman meaning Velir Mahan. He was the ruler from the Velir clan, obviously a Kirar, in charge of several villages with no pretensions of the great Chola sovereign at that time, says KNS. Nevertheless, representative of the early Chola dynasty, KNS makes out that Veerai was on the sea coast from yet another line by poet Marutham Ilannaganar, a later poet, sung in Agananuru poem 206, Adupor Velir Veerai Mundurai, Neduvel Uppin Niramba Kuppei. Here, the poem talks about the salt pans of Veerai. Tittan was probably more ambitious than his predecessors and set his sights on Urandai, obviously because of the vantage point that the town enjoyed on the banks of the river Kaveri. Fired with ambition, he captured Urandai from Sendan. This is attested to by the following verses in the Agananuru poem 137, again sung by Mudukuttanar. Vendari Murasin Virarpor Cholarin, Kadunkallin Urandai Angan. The victorious Cholas are celebrating the capture of Urandai by beating their Murasu drums and enjoying toddy. Soon after the capture of Urandai, Tittan created several fortifications around the town and made it his capital city. Yet another poem by Paranar in Agananuru, song 122, that begins, Irumpiri Maha ar Ivazhungal Moodur, Vidivaindru Ayinum Tunjadu Ahum. A very beautiful poem, again being a love poem with a very different context. Here, the heroine describes the several hurdles that the hero has to cross in order to come and meet her in a clandestine way. She goes, even during the non-festive days, this town is alive and people are in celebratory mode all night. Even after the people go to sleep, my mother, who is constantly watching me, does not sleep. Then even when my mother sleeps, the soldiers who are out patrolling the streets do not sleep. And finally, when the soldiers go to sleep, the dogs on the street, she here specifically mentions a she-dog, Nyali Nai, meaning a Nyamali, a female dog, which barks at the sight of strangers. The poem goes on to enlist a further set of hurdles, and the heroine ends with a very beautiful simile saying that these are like the hurdles that the great king Tittan has created around his capital of Urandai, which the enemies can never cross. So from this, we may reasonably conclude that soon after his victory over Urandai, Tittan set about putting its defences in order and making it impregnable. Being an ambitious sovereign, Tittan soon captures Arkadu, the forest of Alisi. A verse in Nattinai stanza 87, sung by the lady poetess Nakkanai, who is the daughter of one Perungoli Nayakan, points this out very clearly. Velpor Solar Arisiyam Perungatu. The Arisiyam Kadu, which was now under the control of the victorious Cholas. What is interesting is that Arkadu denotes a forest of the R tree, that is the Atti, a variety of ebony, and the Cholas adopt the R or Atti as their royal emblem. The Chola kings wore garlands of the R flower when they went to war. So KNS credits Vediyan Tittan as the founder proper of the early Chola dynasty. Another very interesting footnote that KNS gives is that the place Sendamangalam, today in the South Arcot district, could be a remnant piece of history connecting this place to its ancient ruler Sendan. The only chief to have been identified as a contemporary of Veliyan Tittan, the line of rulers of Arcot came to an end with Sendan, giving way to the superior military power of the Cholas, starting with Veliyan Tittan. And here, KNS gives the time period of rule of Veliyan Tittan as between 50 BCE and 25 BCE. KNS shows that about this time, the Pandyas had established their rule on the banks of the Anporunai, known as Tamrabarani today, in the city of Korkai. They had not yet established themselves at Kudal, the old name of Madurai. Kudal at that time was in the possession of another tribe. Similarly, the Cheras were still confined to Kuttanadu in the western seaboard of North Travancore. We will continue with exploring the rise of the early Cholas in the next episode. Vanakkam.